Well, Kamal, it's finally happened. A history-making moment. Okay, we were sort of expecting it, but not really. And when it finally happened, it was momentous. Joe Biden has dropped out of the US presidential race.
This most astonishing presidential race, Camilla, has just got even more remarkable. Don't forget, last week we had an assassination attempt on one candidate, and now the other candidate has quit. In the statement that he released first on social media, President Biden said that he was ending his campaign for re-election, quote, in the interests of my party. Well, I think it actually came because of intense pressure from his party. He then rapidly endorsed Vice President Kamala Harris to replace him as the Democratic candidate.
News, Kamal, it just keeps on coming, which is why we are recording this special edition of the Daily Tea. And we're recording it because at the end of the day, this is in the aftermath of one of the most significant events in US political history. Not just recent history, Kamal, but actual US political history.
Well, Camilla, let's start this special edition with a full tweet in which Biden announced his decision to quit the presidential race 3 weeks after, we both remember it, his halting performance in that head-to-head TV debate with Donald Trump. This is what he said. It has been the greatest honor of my life to serve as your president. And while it has been my intention to seek re-election, I believe it is in the best interest of my party and the country for me to stand down and focus entirely on fulfilling my duties as president for the remainder of my term.
Shortly after he posted that, he endorsed Kamala Harris, the present vice president, as the Democratic candidate, saying this: my very first decision as the party nominee in 2020 was to pick Kamala Harris as my vice president, and it's been the best decision I've made. Today, I want to offer my full support and endorsement for Kamala to be the nominee of our party this year. Democrats, he said, it's time to come together and beat Trump. Let's do this. Now, before we're joined by our US editor, Tony Diver, let's just take in some other reactions because, of course, they've been coming in thick and fast. Donald Trump wasted no time, Kamal. Rather ungracious, actually. Interesting, he's in reflective mode, maybe not. Fresh from joking about his comb over on the campaign trail. I'm not sure if you saw that clip, but it's quite funny. He said this: crooked Joe Biden was not fit to run for president and is certainly not fit to serve and never was, ! He only attained the position of president by lies, fake news, capped up, and not leaving his basement, also capped up. All those around him, including his doctor and the media, knew that he wasn't capable of being president, and he wasn't. And now look what he's done to our country with millions of people coming across our border, totally unchecked and unvetted, many from prisons, mental institutions, and record numbers of terrorists. We will suffer greatly because of his presidency, but we will remedy the damage he has done very quickly. Make America great again. That's the best Trump impression I can do on the phone.
I'm not quite sure, Camilla, where the new, kindly, almost Jesus-like figure it was suggested Donald Trump would strike after the assassination attempt has gone. Some pretty brutal language there and something very reminiscent of how Trump has campaigned throughout his political career. On the Democrat side, obviously much more supportive messages. California Governor Gavin Newsom, who was actually once thought of as a possible candidate and who knows, could be again. He praised Joe Biden, saying he will go down in history as one of the most impactful and selfless presidents. Thank you, at Joe Biden.
Jill Biden, Joe Biden's wife, responded to her husband's statement by retweeting it with a double heart emoji, which I thought was very sweet. I also noted as I quickly scoured Twitter, X, whatever we want to call it, that London Mayor Sadiq Khan, ever the most ambitious man in the Labour Party, Kamal, was the first out of the traps. He even tweeted before Keir Starmer to say, putting your country first demonstrates true and inspiring leadership. Thank you, at Joe Biden, for your service, your courage, and your commitment to progressive politics. Probably not that much of a surprise considering he was one of Donald Trump's most vocal critics.
Keir Starmer, I suppose, Camilla, will have to take a little bit of care about how he responds in a way that Sadiq Khan doesn't have to consider.
Kamal, as ever, Telegraph readers reacting in their droves on the website. Elizabeth Kirkby writes, I'm glad to see Biden has now made the right decision. He can now stand down as president with a certain amount of dignity and integrity. I'm not sure about what will happen next. I do feel sorry for the people of the USA. They still do not have much of a choice regarding the next president of the United States.
I think Elizabeth Kirkby there makes a very powerful point. Here's another from Bob Bayliss. 3 months too late to make any difference, regardless of who the Democrats put up. Donald Trump has momentum and will win the popular vote, which no Republican has done since Ronald Reagan.
And Fiona White says, Joe Biden has done the right thing and the American people will have to decide on an upper age limit for their president. And that also applies to Donald Trump. He's no spring chicken either. This goes back to the point, Kamal, that we have discussed before, that the American people do have this Sophie's choice between Trump and now not Biden, but Harris.
I mean, the historic nature of this is really astonishing. Only 2 presidents have not sought a second term, Harry Truman in 1952 and Lyndon Johnson in 1968. And Biden certainly is the only president this close to the actual election day to drop out of the race itself.
I mean, the news is still shocking, isn't it, Kamal? Because, OK, we've prepped for it. We have discussed this many, many times on the Daily Tea, this idea of can he hang on in there? We've talked about him doubling down and insisting that he will. We've talked about the prospect of him going and what that might mean logistically, and we'll get onto that in just a moment. But even though we prepared for him to pull out, and the mood music was increasingly indicating that was so towards the end of last week, it's still a shock for something that momentous to happen.
It is. Tony's on the line. I think, Tony, you had to leave a baseball match. Thank you so much for joining us for this special edition of the Daily Tea. Can we just ask you, Camilla's point? Everyone said that, frankly, 2 or 3 people were going to make this decision. It was either going to be Jill Biden, Barack Obama, or Biden said, God himself. Well, obviously, we don't know about the last of those 3, but what do you put it down to that he has finally come to this decision?
Well, Kamal, I think the best way to think about Biden's decision-making is a kind of series of concentric circles around him. On the outside, you've got those congressmen who've had some concerns for a while. You know, Joe Manchin, Dean Phillips have been talking about Biden's health now for months. And he's lost a lot more of those people in the last 3 weeks. We've seen all of those statements, almost 3 dozen congressmen have come out. But actually, Biden's not too worried about that, we don't think. The people he's more worried about are the people the next circle in, those senior figures within the party, people like Nancy Pelosi, Barack Obama, and his top aides and allies in Congress, people like Chuck Schumer and Hakeem Jeffries. Those are the sorts of people that he's been losing over the last week or so. And in the last few days, we've seen a lot of briefing in the papers that suggests that those people have deeper concerns perhaps than they first said. And then you've got his top aides, the people who actually work for him on his campaign, who've been going out in the media and defending him. Those people, it seems like he lost in the last 48 hours or so. And then right in the middle, you've got Biden himself with his wife, Jill. He said before he doesn't make any of these kind of decisions without consulting her. She is, in many ways, his chief of staff and his top aide, even in all but name. And so it seems to me that he would never have taken this decision without her backing. She's been one of the people who has been defending him the most strongly over the last few weeks. And if he's gone, then it suggests that she's changed her mind.
Also pressure piling in from Barack Obama, Nancy Pelosi, and some pretty bad polling as well, Tony, since the assassination attempt on Trump.
Well, that's right. And I think if things were already bad for Biden because of things that he'd done and said, the assassination attempt really changed the game, and it wasn't anything to do with him. And we've actually seen Trump's poll position increase in some of these swing states and also in true blue states, sort of places like New York and Virginia, which you never would have expected to go to the Republicans 6 months ago, now look like they're in contention. And so I think that has had a pretty major impact. And it's forced the Biden campaign to stop with its pretty hostile rhetoric towards Trump, calling him a dictator, which had become the main campaign strategy going into November. They've had to stop all of that because of claims that it's that kind of language which led to people wanting to kill Trump. So the campaign was already looking in disarray and looking like it was going to have to change its stance. But it seems like for a lot of those swing voters, this was just one thing too many, and they could no longer support him.
If he's not fit to run for office again, Tony, this obviously raises the question whether he's fit enough to be president. He's still, I think, isolating with COVID. But Speaker Mike Johnson, a Republican, has already said that he should resign from office, saying that if Joe Biden is not fit to run for president, he's not fit to serve as president. Similar words to Donald Trump. What do you think about the pressure on him actually fully quitting as president and Kamala Harris becoming president now?
Well, I don't think there's any chance of that happening. I mean, he's got another 3 months to do this job before the election. And I think it would have to be a very serious health crisis before he would consider standing down. I mean, of course, we know under the US Constitution, the person who would take over from him in that circumstance is Kamala Harris. But I think the pressure on him is really a question of whether or not he can win an election and whether or not he would still be fit to govern in 4 years' time at the end of the next term. I don't think there'll be any calls other than from those kinds of Republicans that you mentioned for him to give up the presidency immediately.
Also, this endorsement of Kamala Harris, I mean, does that make it a done deal that then she becomes the nominee? Because I again note an intervention from Nancy Pelosi, the former Speaker of the House of Representatives. And she's saying that it must be an open process. I guess there are Democrats quite keen to ensure that Trump can't capitalize on the idea of it being some kind of stitch up or setup.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, we don't really know exactly how it's going to work from now on. And in fact, the endorsement of Kamala Harris didn't even come until a second tweet. It wasn't in his original statement, which does suggest to me that this whole thing has been done in quite a rushed way from Biden HQ or from where he's isolated in Delaware. What seems like is going to happen at the moment is that there will be an open process where a nominee will be decided, but Kamala Harris will go into it with a strong endorsement of the president, which puts her, as a significant frontrunner. There is a way that there could be a kind of coronation where she could be given the nomination, but it doesn't look that clear at the moment that that's going to happen. It seems like there's going to be some kind of process. But, stress, this has only just happened, and exactly what comes next is still a bit unclear.
I think officially, Tony, I think 3,937 delegates that Biden has supporting him for the nomination now become free agents. I think we're in slightly uncharted territory this close to an election, what will actually happen at the convention. And just to your point that this appears to have been done with great rapidity. Apparently, New York Times is reporting that his senior staff were only told at 1:45 p.m. US time, and 1 minute later, the tweet was sent out. So there's clearly been a rush for some reason today for this to be announced with such rapidity. The media were reporting only in the last 24, 48 hours that Biden was pushing back and was annoyed at being trapped and being forced almost from office. That appears to have gone away.
Well, that's right. And I think that tells us more than anything that this is a decision that's been taken by Biden himself, perhaps with the assistance of his wife and a couple of other people. I mean, the Biden campaign has become a bit of a leaking ship in terms of the media in the last couple of weeks, as some people on that campaign have lost confidence in all the work that they're doing to try and get him reelected. But you're right. I mean, this is not something that we predicted this morning. And it does suggest that while self-isolating in Delaware with COVID, Biden has had a bit of a soul-searching moment and he's decided that now's the time to go. But certainly, I mean, even the best and most well-sourced journalists in Washington were reporting only this morning that there was a Biden fightback going on this weekend. And so he has managed in his final decision to keep that under wraps and go on his own terms.
Tony, I appreciate it's only just happened, but what does it mean for Trump's chances of winning?
Well, Trump's chances of winning are already very good. The latest polls and indeed the betting market suggest that Trump is going to win. It is worth saying that Harris does poll slightly better than Biden at this point. The main argument for keeping Biden on for some months has been that there was no one else who polls as well as him. And in the last couple of weeks, that poll lead that he has over his own colleagues has been eroded. There is some polls that suggest that in swing states, especially Arizona and Nevada, Kamala Harris would poll better than him and may have the edge. But there are no polls that suggest that she would win over him. Of course, there is a whole new presidential campaign that now has to be launched for the next 3 months. And so all of that can change as she works out what her main message is going to be going into November. But at the moment, she's certainly not the favourite.
What's she actually like, Tony? I mean, she's had quite a lot of criticism that she hasn't fulfilled her potential. People have accused her of sort of spouting slightly Duchess of Sussex-esque word salad. I mean, she's not quite made her mark, but I suppose things might change now.
Well, that's right. I think it's difficult to make your mark when you are the VP and when you're not the main person who's doing things from the Oval Office. She's had several policy issues that have been given to her, and that includes security on the southern US border, which, as we all know, has not been a great success under the Biden administration. There has been a huge amount of illegal migration, which has become a bit of a political football. So that is a bit of an albatross around her neck, shall we say, not to mix metaphors, going into the election. But she's also had responsibility for pushing the campaign's message on abortion and reproductive health rights, which has been a success. And we have seen a lot of reticence, even from registered Republicans, to support a party which is pushing either a federal abortion ban or significant restrictions happening in states. So that will count in her favour. She's also had some experience on the international stage. She, of course, came to the UK to jointly launch AI institutes on both sides of the Atlantic last year, and she was the Biden administration's kind of main representative on that. She spoke in the UK about that. So she has had some diplomatic experience, but of course, no vice president ever has the kind of experience, exposure and international work that a president will have. And so we'll be expect to see some attempt to regain that ground in the next 3 months.
I think Kamala Harris as well, given that this will all be, well, a lot of this will be about turnout. Of course, Donald Trump only lost the 2020 presidential election because Joe Biden generated the highest ever vote for a presidential candidate. The second highest ever vote was for Donald Trump. Harris is very connected to the Democrat base. She's seen in American terms as what we might describe as left wing. I mean, that's a very different thing in America than in the UK. And also, I think it's been reported, Tony, that she will easily inherit Joe Biden's donor base, the cash. A lot of an election is all about cash, and a number of the donors have already come out in support not only of Joe Biden's resignation, but Harris herself. So in a sense, she maybe carries a little bit more of the heart of the Democrats. I think, frankly, if it was a toss of a coin between Kamala Harris and Joe Biden, Harris has surely got a better chance than Joe Biden ever would have had, given that every move he made, every stumble, every brain freeze was under such scrutiny.
I think that's right. And I think there has been this intense pressure on him, not least from the media and from some of his closest allies as well. I mean, Joe Biden is a creature of Washington. He cares about what the top columnists of the New York Times and the Washington Post say. He's very in touch with liberal elite opinion. And those are the people that have been among those turning against him in the last few weeks. So I think you're right. I mean, if he had stayed in from now until election day, we would have been looking for every single slip up and gaffe that he could possibly make. And there are a lot of those appearances, of course, because when you're fighting election campaign, you're speaking, sometimes in 3 states a day. So I think it would have been very difficult for him to carry on. A potential issue for Harris, as she is seen, as you say, as being on the left of the party. She's also former California senator. She's seen perhaps as representing that kind of California liberal element of the party, whereas Biden is more of a kind of East Coast, salt of the earth, manufacturing Rust Belt type president. And that was the kind of coalition that was built in the 2020 campaign between the two of them. So what will be interesting to see if Harris does get the nomination is who she picks to be her VP and whether or not it is someone that appeals to the same kind of base as Biden did.
And from memory, Tony, didn't she, when she stood for the nomination some years ago, her campaign was riven with division and she was not seen as an easy person to work for or with?
That's right. And of course, now we will turn to looking at her presidential campaign and what kind of policy issues as well that she was supporting. She had a very strong focus on race relations. She talked a lot about what Democrats can do for black voters. She's very keen on LGBTQ rights, all of those kind of identity issues, which Biden is not so associated with, given the fact that he's been in Washington for 50 years and therefore is really a politician of a different generation. So we can expect to see a lot of that stuff, I would expect, in the next few months. Then again, a lot of that kind of identity politics has the potential to alienate swing voters in the US who are perhaps not as supportive across the board of those kinds of conversations as voters in the UK. So there might be a strategic call on whether to push those sorts of messages in the next 3 months.
And Tony, what do you think this all means for Biden's legacy? I mean, it's unfortunate, isn't it, that recent events have sort of overshadowed what has been, a pretty impressive political career, both as vice president under Obama, but also before some of these unfortunate missteps and gaffes.
That's right. I thought it was interesting that he didn't use that letter that he posted on Twitter earlier today as an opportunity to lay out many of his achievements. A moment like this is a real opportunity for a president to use their statement as a way of shaping their legacy, as a chance to use a bit of political rhetoric and to try and spin themselves in the history books. He didn't do too much of that. He mentioned a couple of things that he'd done in office, but I think history will look kindly on Joe Biden as a man who passed the Inflation Reduction Act, which was a major piece of industrial policy legislation. He's forgiven a lot of student debt, which is a very popular policy here. And he's taken a pretty strong stance on international conflicts as well, especially in Ukraine, but also in Gaza, where he's been a major supporter of Israel. And that will be something that will appeal to a lot of voters, present and future, I would say.
Kamal, we might get a little tongue-tied because I'm Camilla, you're Kamal, we're talking about Kamala. We need to get Harris on the podcast and see if we can actually cope with this.
I know, all three of us. Not very thoughtful, is it, of this podcast and the American election all coming at the same time for our wonderful audience.
So this is obviously an emergency extra helping of the Daily Tea in light of recent events. Don't worry, though, we will be back as normal with a 5 p.m. podcast on Monday, bringing you up to date with everything that's happened in the US presidential race. And Kamal, I would expect more news because the news is coming so thick and fast, we're struggling to keep up.
It never stops. Join us again tomorrow, 5 p.m.
Take me out to the ball game. Take me.
We got through 2 innings of 9 before this came through. So
what a week.